Okay. So you do what you want, but from our viewpoint, you can definitely take off your mask when you present.
Okay.
You feel better because it's really good.
Sure, yeah. I might keep it on just in case. I mean,
whatever you prefer. Yeah.
Sure.
Okay, so we're live.
Okay.
So
Perfect.
welcome, Eric Klotzer, to this inequality debate entitled Populism: How Economic Fairness Can Win Back Disenchanted Voters. Perhaps, Thomas, you want to say a few words?
Well, yeah, no, just we're very glad to have you today and tell us about this book on this very, very important topic. Let me simply say that yeah, we're going to have a number of other events to plan, but maybe I will say a word about this at the end. You know, basically the floor is yours. So I don't know how long you have planned for your presentation.
Perfect. So
you plan to talk for how long?
About 45 to about 45 minutes.
Okay,
Yeah.
excellent. Yeah. And so well, let's start. I'm wondering whether the light. No, there's nothing we can do. No, it's okay. It's speed up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you guys see in the back?
We want some light because we don't see that much.
Yeah.
Oh shoot. Yeah. We want people.
Which light? Because I tried to do something that is.
Yeah, it doesn't work.
Parce que ça allait pas la lumière. Ok. Sorry.
Okay. I suppose I'll need that. Okay, well, let me start by saying I want to thank you guys so much for coming here tonight. To those of you who are here digitally, thank you also for joining us on YouTube. This is an amazing opportunity to be, speaking here at the World Inequality Lab in Paris. I want to tell you guys a little bit about myself and why my co-author and I decided to write this book. My co-author, Paul Somerville, and I, we've been doing stuff in various capacities for about 10 years now. And we started this project in early 2019, when we were worried, like many people, about the rise of illiberal populism in various formats, seen in things through perhaps Donald Trump in the US. You might think of Marine Le Pen and the Rassemblement National in France. Naturally, we were concerned. But we were also concerned that a lot of the debate and the dialogue, especially from the political world and a policymaking perspective, was looking at it from an angle that did not perhaps resonate with the real concerns that were driving people into the arms of populist leaders. And so we wrote this book sort of with that angle, and you can see that it's evident in the title, Reclaiming Populism. We're taking a view of this that the forces of populism among the electorate are something not to be beaten down and defeated, but something that must be recaptured by the political mainstream in a way that addresses the serious concerns of citizens who are driven toward illiberal populist leaders around the world. I'm Eric Klotzer. I'm a research fellow at Harvard University's Growth Lab, and we're going to go through a couple of different agenda items today, starting with an overview of the book and sort of what separates this book from a lot of the other material on the market. Then we're going to look at three main body points that cover sort of the main thrust of the arguments of the book. And I want to emphasize that in doing so, I'm going to keep the conversation at a level that is open to a general audience. There are some, statistical and philosophical details that go into the book, but I want to keep the discussion at a level sort of ideas that's open to the general public. So we're going to go through how economic unfairness leads to populism, as we argue. We're going to look at the policy inputs to a fairer economy and how to diagnose constraints to social mobility in different countries. And then I'll finish with a conclusion. I think we're just perhaps experiencing some technical, technical difficulties.
There you go. Sorry for the interruption, but
no, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it.
The presentation to the participants.
Yeah.
And there you go. And I put you in full screen mode.
Okay. Thank you, Olivia. Okay, yeah, apologies for that, technical difficulties. So let's get started with an overview of the book and what separates it out from the other things you might find on the market. So the typical book on populism opines on how worrisome its leaders are. You might think of some of these gentlemen seen on the right here. And it discusses the causes behind populism in a way typically that offers some sort of long-standing political concern that explains voters' motives. Typically something like there being too many poisonous ideas in society, hence arguments about social media. You might think of other movements earlier in time, or there being too many foreigners in society, or too much income and wealth inequality. Now, I want to emphasize that reclaiming populism sharply diverges from that sort of status quo of the existing conversation around populism that refers to sort of these long-standing political ideas. We're taking a stance that the core motivations in many cases behind populism are not especially well understood. And in particular, we're arguing that the extant debate fails to capture the legitimate economic unfairness that citizens are often really angry at. And we go on, and this is especially something that separates us from many books on the market about populism. We offer detailed, actionable policy advice to fix the root issues behind populism. So, all being told, reclaiming populism argues that populism strikes hardest when the economy is unfair. It contends that a fair, socially mobile economy is possible through equal opportunity and fair, unequal outcomes. And it shows how to diagnose which missing policy inputs most constrain social mobility in a given country. With that, let's move on to sort of the content of the arguments with which we make that case, beginning with how economic unfairness leads to populism. Now, this is a diagram that shows the causal model that we have in mind here, which begins with a pool of policy failures. We'll have more detail on that later on in the presentation, but it begins with a pool of policy failures that lead to problems surrounding opportunity being less equal and reward being less a function of contribution. And these two pools of problems make it hard for citizens to get ahead on their own merits if they're in a precarious economic position, with two tangible consequences. One being persistently low social mobility in the sense of intergenerational income elasticity for those of you from academia, and also high vulnerability to economic shocks. So whether you have an unlucky start in life or are knocked down by an economic crisis, it makes it difficult for citizens to get ahead on their own merits. When this happens, it creates perceptions of an unfair economy and an unfair society, and thereby leads to populism, where essentially citizens see the need for some sort of forceful correction of a rigged system. Now, in order to take this kind of model seriously, we naturally need to answer a couple of questions at various segments in the process. And what I want to begin with is why we should think citizens actually care about these problems, which we're terming economic unfairness collectively, to begin with, opportunity being less equal and reward being less according to contribution. And we make the case that there is strong evidence that people care a lot about fair economic outcomes. And in particular, that these are very different from conventional concerns of whether outcomes are equal or unequal. Now, that may seem like kind of a strange and obtuse statement, especially me speaking here at the World Inequality Lab in Paris. So I want to offer this quote from Angus Deaton, a Nobel laureate in economics, just to give sort of a primer on why you might take that idea seriously. And he wrote in a Project Syndicate column that inequality is not the same thing as unfairness. And to my mind, it is the latter that has incited so much political turmoil in the rich world today. Some of the processes that generate inequality are widely seen as fair, but others are deeply and obviously unfair and have become a legitimate source of anger and disaffection. And just to be very concrete about what that might entail, I have sort of a hypothetical example for you of two scenarios to consider. So scenario one on the left is a scenario of unfair inequality. And this is the sort of typical thing that people think of when they think of movements like Occupy, or the sort of typical anger at the excesses of the market. And we have a situation here where, say, person A works spectacularly hard, is very talented, but because of the economic system they live in, they can't afford an education. So let's say they only got $1 sum of both. In contrast, person B, let's say that they get rich financing bad mortgages, they crash the global economy, but in doing so, they get $3 sum of both. Now, most people would, I think, rightly see this as a pretty atrociously unjust situation. You have a situation where person A does not have equal opportunity, and person B gets a reward that is far above and beyond their contributions to society. And they get $1 sign versus $3 signs as well, let's say. In scenario 2, in contrast, we have a situation of fair inequality. In this situation, let's say that person A is afforded all the advantages in life. They come from the right family, everything like that, but they just don't study hard in school. They don't work hard at their career, and so they wind up with only $1 sign of wealth. In contrast, here, person B invents, let's say, a new clean energy source, and they help to solve global warming. They get $3 signs of wealth as a result. Now, most people looking at that, their moral intuition, at least my moral intuition, would tell me that scenario 1 is clearly much more unjust than scenario 2. And yet the outcomes in terms of the wealth inequalities in these scenarios are the same, which would lead one to perhaps argue that the real discerner of injustice in this situation is not so much the inequality of outcome, it's the reasons for those outcomes and whether they are fair or unfair. And in fact, once you take those differences into account, you can look at the behavioral science research on the topic. And this is a quote from a paper from the Yale psychologists Starman, Cheston, and Bloom in their paper, Why People Prefer Unequal Societies, where they say that after separating these things, there is no evidence that people are bothered by economic inequality itself. And there they mean inequalities of outcomes. Rather, they are bothered by something that is often confounded or confused with inequality, economic unfairness. And once you sorted out those two differences, they go on to point out that actually, once you look at economic fairness specifically, 1 to 2-year-old babies, for example, expect more resources to be allocated to those who have done more work. 6-year-olds prefer to allocate more resources to someone who has done more work, even when they have the option to allocate rewards equally. And that, for instance, individuals surveyed across 16 countries overwhelmingly prefer a decidedly unequal as opposed to equal distribution of economic outcomes in society. And this is not an outlier position in behavioral sciences. This is a quote from Stéphane Debove in a PhD thesis on the evolutionary origins of human fairness, where he wrote that, I'm sorry, the screen is hiding it a little bit. Let me just move that for you. It is well accepted in the behavioral sciences that people prefer income distributions with strong work-salary correlations, prefer to give more into individuals whose input is more valuable, and favor meritocratic distributions as a whole in both micro and macro justice contexts. Now, that all being said, we are at the World Inequality Lab in Paris. I want to reassure you, none of this is saying that inequality is somehow unimportant. All it is specifically saying is that the behavioral sciences would lead us to perhaps believe that people are especially sensitive to concerns about fairness in general, that people are very sensitive to whether economic outcomes and opportunities are according to what people really deserve. So with that in mind, having shown that people are really sensitive to the idea of economic unfairness, then we could turn to the question of, do we believe that the consequences of economic unfairness are in fact concretely linked to populism? So one way we could look at that, which we do in the book, is by looking at low social mobility, in the sense that in a society with low social mobility, individual economic success strongly depends on family wealth. Now, family wealth, of course, is not an innate driver of productivity. It's this, transferable, redistributable thing. And it is not associated with how successful you should be in the sense of economic fairness. And thus, low social mobility is a very clear violation of economic fairness in this sense. And we demonstrate, in fact, in the research in the book, that low social mobility is a robust statistical predictor of the geography of contemporary rich world populism, both across and within high income countries, looking both in North America and Europe and across the developed world broadly. In contrast, factors like income and wealth inequality, immigration, and social media do not have this kind of robust statistical predictive power. To give a bit of support and perhaps for the argument, I just want to mention that this research behind the book, we put it online as a technical appendix in the form of a working paper. It's been cited in official documents by the United Nations, the IMF, the Inter-American Development Bank, and it's been featured by Brookings. And in a recent research paper, Professor Philip McCann, who coined the term geography of discontent, cited that research to write that social mobility is the crucial indicator of populist voting. Alternatively, you could look at the political effects of major economic shocks, especially because so much of the discourse around populism focuses highly on the deleterious effects of things like the global financial crisis and globalization. And it's often framed in terms of something like, corrupt elites having rigged the system and taking all the gains for themselves while leaving others to wither in a very unfair way. And we could ask whether this has transpired in a way that does lead to populism through mechanisms of unfairness specifically. So one example of evidence there pertaining to the global financial crisis is from this paper by Funke, Schulerich, and Trebesch, where they studied the political ramifications of financial crises from 1870 to 2014. And they write that on average, far-right parties increase their vote share by 30% after a financial crisis. But importantly, we do not observe similar political dynamics in normal recessions or after severe macroeconomic shocks that are not financial in nature. Now, that's a very interesting statement, especially if you're an economist, because you have a situation where you have two losses, essentially, what these authors are arguing, that are similar or if not the same in value. And yet the political ramifications of one type of shock are very different. They lead to much more support for far-right parties than the other, simply because of the way that transpired. And naturally, you might ask, well, do you have a hypothesis as to why that might have occurred? And the authors argue, what explains the more severe political fallout after financial crises? One possibility is that non-financial downturns are seen as excusable events triggered by exogenous shocks, while financial crises may be perceived as endogenous and inexcusable. I might use the word unfair, the result of policy failures, moral hazard, and favoritism. And thus, there is an argument, in fact, that something like the global financial crisis has led to increased support for populism, specifically through the mechanism of economic unfairness in particular. You might also look at the political economy surrounding globalization. This is a paper from the Harvard Kennedy School's own Danny Roderick, whose office is just one floor below mine, where he writes in this paper, Populism and the Economics of Globalization, that economists understand that trade causes job displacement and income losses for some groups, but they have a hard time making sense of why trade gets picked on so much by populists, both on the right and the left. After all, imports are only one source of churn in labor markets, and typically not even the most important. And his answer, and this is a quote from his paper, is that it's one thing to lose your job to someone who competes under the same rules as you do. It's a different thing when you lose your job to someone who takes advantage of lax labor, environmental, tax, or safety standards in other countries. What arouses popular opposition is not inequality per se, but perceived unfairness. Thus, on the whole, there is evidence, and of course we elaborate in the book on all of this, that citizens turn to populism when they are fed up with an unfair economy. They feel the system is rigged and must be forcefully reset. We see other factors like social media and immigration as not necessarily, they're not irrelevant, but we see them as amplifiers of these kinds of phenomena. And just to really drive the point home and sort of connect it with perhaps the more concrete ethos of populism, I have a quote here from the Boston Globe in 2016, drawing upon a conversation they had with a swing voter who ultimately opted for Trump. And he in particular is very concerned with the unfair relationship between contribution and reward. He said, I see my tax dollars going to handouts for others who didn't work as hard as I did, and I can't afford my health care. Everyone is being taken care of but me. I feel left out, and it makes me feel that I want my country back. So if you buy that argument, the next natural question is, how can you actually support policy inputs that lead to a fairer and more socially mobile economy? which is this section back there that I mentioned earlier. Now, something I want to clarify right from the get-go is that social mobility is certainly not guaranteed by a lot of the sort of political offerings that you might get from the right and the left that emphasize that, oh, it's just a matter of small government or it's just a matter of big government. This chart here on the x-axis has government spending as a share of GDP in 2018. And then on the y-axis is social mobility in the sense that I told you about earlier, where countries with high social mobility are down at the bottom of the chart and countries with low social mobility are at the top of the chart. And you can see quite plainly that there are both small government states with quite poor social mobility, such as the United States and the United Kingdom, but also high government spending countries like Italy or France, where we are now, that also suffer from low social mobility. And thus one might be led to believe that it's not as simple as just a big or small government program. It's about getting the right policy inputs in place. And in our book, we argue that the most socially mobile countries use policies that enable equal opportunity and fair, unequal outcomes. We argue that countries like Australia, Canada, and the Nordic countries pair state-sponsored equal opportunity with competitive markets in order to achieve that. They are socially mobile and populism resistant. Evident in the way, for instance, that places like Australia and Canada have not seen the same kind of populist backlash that a comparator in the United States has had. You might also look at the Nordic countries, which, in spite of the immense disruption from the 2015 European migrant crisis, nevertheless have not had to deal with the ramifications of events as severe as Brexit or seen levels of support for populism as high as in places like France and Italy. In contrast, places that fail on either of these categories of inputs tend to suffer the consequences. The US, for example, has competitive outcomes, but it certainly does not support equal opportunity due to its threadbare social safety net. France, on the other hand, has a world-class social safety net, world-class public services, but it arguably has an overbearing state that regulates and taxes away the fruits of success, especially for people who are trying to work their way into the middle class. Both countries suffer from low social mobility and they suffer from fierce populist movements. Now, the policy inputs that support those twin pillars of equal opportunity and unequal outcomes, we argue, are themselves quite complex. We have a diagram here. I recognize it's a bit unwieldy. I'm going to walk you through it on the whole overall very briefly, and then we're going to look at it sort of part by part. You can see that at the top is economic fairness. You might imagine social mobility up there. You have equal opportunity and fair and equal outcomes. And then you have a variety of categories of inputs to those things that support them. For example, equal opportunity must occur with respect to personal characteristics, both entailing formal equal opportunity or freedom from discrimination and substantive equal opportunity, such as the ability to become productive and access hubs of economic agglomeration. Protection with respect to unfair events like a financial crisis or even getting ill or losing your job in a cyclical downturn. And fair unequal outcomes, on the other hand, are supported by the state's capacity to reward value creation through the market and also to punish cheaters to ensure that unequal outcomes, insofar as they do occur, are fair and not unfair. So, like I said, that probably seems a bit unwieldy. So I think it's easier to comprehend if you imagine the life trajectory of someone who experiences social mobility themselves. You can imagine that, say, someone is born into a working class family and they're going to work their way up to become a middle class, let's say a plumber or an accountant. It doesn't really matter whether they're blue or white collar. And you can ask yourself what needs to happen along the way. So to begin with, and this is something that often constitutes the entire debate on social mobility, but I feel really shouldn't, the first thing that needs to happen is that person must have the opportunity to become productive. They have to be able to access critical inputs like childhood nutrition and access to education. But like I said, the debates I feel is too focused on that particular area and needs to look beyond it. For example, if someone is going to then go on from having received an education and actually look for a job in the workplace, in the labor market, they must be able to access hubs of economic opportunity. And relevant inputs there include things like housing and transport infrastructure that have heavily featured in the leveling up debate in the United Kingdom, that are equally critical to supporting this person on their path toward entering the middle class. If someone can get an education, access an economic agglomeration, the economy that they face must then actually be able to offer them ample job and business opportunities. And this is something that is not often recognized, but we argue that social mobility requires a competitive private sector, because that is the only way to have widespread opportunity, both within the labor market and for entrepreneurship, things like that, supported by efficient markets, and in turn, a whole huge host of economic inputs that can be conventionally understood as perhaps the literature on economic growth. Now, when someone, say, reaches that economic hub of agglomeration, they must be able to compete for a job in a way that is free from discrimination, both legally and in culture, so that they are not tossed out from a labor market interview simply because of the color of their skin or their gender identity or what have you. And at the same time, they have to be able to compete in a way that's free from economic cheaters. It's no good if you go to start a business and there's a monopolist next door, or a business that undercuts safety standards or something like that, that makes the unequal outcomes that are necessary for social mobility unfair. It has to be that there has to be a justice system and taxation, and a system of taxation and regulation in place in order to constrain that kind of unfairness that can occur and ensure that competitive competition occurs in a fair way. The entire way that occurs, from someone getting an education to competing in the labor market to getting a job or starting a business, the state has to minimize the chance of society-wide unfair events such as financial crises. That's where you might think that something like financial regulation, the Dodd-Frank Act, and what have you, would have a role to play. But at the same time as minimizing the chance of society-wide unfair events, the state also has a very critical role to ensure against unavoidable sort of personal tragedies, the kind of unfair events that can derail a person's future opportunity through things like ill health or a job loss in a cyclical downturn. And that's where inputs like healthcare or unemployment insurance have such a critical role. Collectively, as such, there are multitudinous complementary policy inputs to social mobility. There's a whole wide array, and very few countries have high social mobility, mainly because, we argue, it requires getting so many different things right. It's not as simple as just having a large amount of redistribution or a good education system. There are so many things that need to happen if someone is to really experience social mobility, going from the working class to the middle class, for example. And I've just got that whole diagram there as sort of a reminder for you all. Now, that being said, I want to have this section here on diagnosing constraints to social mobility in a particular country. And the reason why I kind of diagnose is to figure out where in that tree of inputs your problem is because we see inputs to social mobility and to economic production broadly as complements and not substitutes. And what that means concretely is that, for example, if you have a really terrible education system, you cannot fix that by investing more in transport infrastructure. You've got to go and fix your schools. So these various inputs, we see them as things that are complements and not substitutes. And because of that, it's critical to diagnose which inputs most severely constrain social mobility in a particular country in order to ensure that your reform actions are along the right path. So in order to do that, we take a leaf extending the diagnostic methodology practiced by the place where I work, Harvard University's Growth Lab, where we typically take this diagnostic methodology and we apply it to the problem of economic growth in order to figure out which missing inputs most constrain an economic output. And the core idea here, there's a whole set of steps that are imbued in the diagnostic methodology. We present them briefly in the book with some case examples. But the core idea of the diagnostic method is that the most binding constraints to an economic output are highly desired and also scarce. And as such, they give off corresponding signals in the data, which even if you can't run something like an RCT or find a natural experiment, you can still look for those signals and act in a Bayesian way to become more and more confident in your assessment the more data you can collect that's pointing in the same direction. So to give a concrete example, sort of a mini example of how that works and what you might look for, we have the question here of, should we worry, if we're concerned about social mobility, should we worry that university education in Italy is so low? Because it's quite indisputable that the rate of university completion and attainment in Italy is among the lowest supply in the developed world. But what we argue is that you ought not to look at just the supply. You also need to look at the demand, and you need to ask yourself, is it highly demanded? Because if the answer is yes, that means expanding university education in Italy would create this, huge payoffs for Italians. You're going to alleviate this scarce input with a weird blockage. People are going to reap the rewards. It's going to be fantastic. But if the answer is no, it's not highly demanded. It may be in low supply precisely because it's in low demand. And if that is the case, you probably have much bigger problems in your economy, and there could be other reform areas that you as a policymaker need to practically emphasize in the short term.
Sorry, so in this example, so what's your answer again?
Well, we're going to see.
Okay.
We're going to see. Yeah. So when you do this kind of exercise, you want to put together a whole slew of data. I'm going to give you sort of just like a miniature taster version of that so that you get the idea of what should be done. So this, for example, is a chart that shows on the x-axis sort of a measure of intergenerational mobility and education. It's the share of people in that country where if you look at the pool of people whose parents did not have a university education, what share of those people themselves went on to complete university. And you can see that Italy is below quite a lot of comparators in that respect. But on the vertical axis, we also have the lifetime returns to tertiary education in thousands of US dollars. So we can see here, at least for citizens, that the return to university education in Italy is comparatively low, which might lead us to think that perhaps it's in low demand.
So it's bigger than Sweden. So,
So one of the processes that we go through in the diagnostic method is to look, for example, at comparator countries, and that's to form sort of like a synthetic collective counterfactual. And the point there is to look here if you buy that other high income countries should be a reasonable counterfactual for Italy. That on the whole, compared to most places, I mean, certainly the returns are positive. Yes, they might be higher in Sweden, but they're really not especially high. So it might lead you to conclude that perhaps university education in Italy it's not in extremely high demand.
so in Sweden, it's even lower than.
It could be, yes. It could be, yeah. You can also look on the firm side. You can look at, for example, this is a set of surveys conducted by the European Investment Bank of European Union countries, in addition to the United Kingdom and the US from 2015 to 2018. I've highlighted Italy with a little cross there under the indicator for skill availability in the labor force. So it's the share of firms that are indicating whether something is a major issue for their business in that country. In particular, in this set of questions, it was whether it was a barrier to further investment to expand the business. And you can see there that Italy is, again, it's not especially high in the distribution of key issues there. There are other things like uncertainty about the future, business regulations, labor market regulations that appear to score higher for Italian firms. And so maybe more to your point that you just made, Pama, the point is not that it's useless to get a university education in places where these things are relatively reported low. It's that there may be other issues that are more binding and more serious to address, right off the get-go. We have another survey here. This is from the World Bank, from the World Enterprise Surveys in particular, looking at a variety of European countries and also separating out Italy as a whole, which is marked with a little X here, and Southern Italy in particular, which is marked with a little plus. And it's looking at the extent to which firms report workforce education as a major issue. And again, you can see for with the other dots for other countries, it's not especially high along these dimensions. There are other issues that seem to be more prominent. And on the whole, this might lead us to conclude And of course, we want to gather more evidence that this is sort of, toward that kind of conclusion that higher education in Italy is in low supply, but it may not be especially highly demanded. And there may be other areas where you need to look more seriously. That's just restating what I just said. It seems like, it's not a clear signal that this thing is a binding constraint that most severely is holding back social mobility in the country. You might look at another example where in the UK, there's been a huge discussion around regional infrastructure and how this is, purportedly going to boost people's livelihoods and boost economic opportunity throughout the country. And you might know to begin with that the UK government on the whole, and there are other ways to cut the data, but I'm just presenting it here as a share of GDP, the share of GDP that has gone toward investment, gross fixed capital investment, so infrastructure or thereabout investments in the country from 1995 to 2015. You can see that compared to other G7 countries, the United Kingdom is a bit of a laggard. It seems to have undersupplied infrastructure in the country as a whole. You might further dig down and say, okay, well, we're really concerned, if we're interested in leveling up, we're really concerned with regions in the UK. And there's a paper from Coyle and Sensier in 2019 that showed that many infrastructure projects approved in London had lower cost benefit ratios than those turned down in regional England, which might lead one to conclude that regional infrastructure is not only scarce throughout the UK as a whole, but doubly scarce in regions, which are getting, spending on projects that's below what they really deserve. You might furthermore look at the demand side of things. And this would be one example of an indicator that you could look for, where in a 2019 Ernst & Young survey, foreign investors showed that transport and technological infrastructure was the top decision factor for foreign investment in UK regions. So if you're concerned about social mobility in these regions and the surrounding lack of economic opportunity, and you see that foreign investors are really concerned about the sheer lack of infrastructure, even ahead of things like the availability of skills, that could be an indicator that better regional infrastructure in the UK is not only in low supply, but also in high demand, and thus could be a binding constraint to economic opportunity and social mobility in that region. After identifying a binding constraint, you should ask, though, well, if there is this weird sort of blockage where you have a situation of low supply and high demand, why is that? Because usually either market forces or political forces would aim to correct that kind of blockage. So you should search for a political economy syndrome that tries to explain the bad equilibrium. In the example of the UK, you might look at the extent of taxation and spending at the level of central versus regional governments. And it could be the case that it's because UK regional governments generally have very little spending power. This is the log population on the x-axis and the share of government investment that is conducted by central governments on the vertical axis. And you can see that there is no other large developed country that spends so much of its investment money at the level of central as opposed to local or regional governments, underpinned by the same problem on the taxation side, that once again, here it's just taxation instead of spending. There's no other large developed country that collects so much taxes at the level of central governments other than the UK. So on the whole, it does seem like the narrative of investing more infrastructure in UK regions is credible as a constraint to economic opportunity and social mobility. And I want to emphasize here that diagnostic analysis can be applied, as you've seen, both at the national and subnational level. It just requires getting creative with the data and interpreting signals in sort of a Bayesian way, where you look at data, you say, okay, well, this points in this direction, you collect some more, and so on and so forth. So with that, we are just on time schedule. I have a few slides to conclude. The first, if I can leave you with any messages and entice you for why to buy the book, because this is a different angle on populism, is that we argue that populist voters ought not to be mischaracterized as uniformly deplorable, stupid, and racist. It's just, we think it's just not the case. We think that populist voters notoriously complain about a rigged system And that the data, in fact, shows they have a point. There is a robust connection that appears to be there between low social mobility, between the unfairness of things like the global financial crisis and globalization, the ways in which people are not getting the opportunities and outcomes that they think they deserve. We'd argue further that because populism is grounded in very real economic unfairness, it cannot be simply beaten down and defeated. It's not something that you can just excoriate and say we're going to dismiss this lot of deplorables. The only option is to reclaim the populist vote by substantively rectifying and truly addressing the economic unfairness that drives it in many cases. And if you're going to do so, the messaging and the policy that you have to execute to win back the populist vote has to be very precisely targeted at a fairer economy and often at the place-specific binding constraints that explain why that place is suffering from a low economy, a low social mobility and unfair economy. And it's important that that kind of messaging and policy execution cannot be confused with conflicting ideological goals that are incompatible with economic fairness, such as aggressive redistribution or laissez-faire neoliberalism. You can see this playing out, for example, in the US right now, where I've been working, where the reception of healthcare is very critical in the Democrat stance toward winning over voters, but it's being confused with all this other messaging about things like banning billionaires and defunding the police, that whatever you think of them are just orthogonal to this goal of greater economic fairness. So with that being said, I'd like to thank you all for your attention today. I hope you found this interesting. I have a discount code for you if you're keen enough that you'd like to buy the book and learn more about what we've been saying. To buy the book, just go to politybooks.com. That's our publisher's website. Search for Reclaiming Populism. And we've got this discount code for you at the checkout. It's INE21. And with that, I'd like to open it to the floor. I know this is supposed to be a debate on inequality. I'm Canadian. I like to have friendly discussion. So let's hear it.
Okay, thanks a lot. So let's start the discussion. I don't know who wants to start. Let me maybe ask you a question. Within Europe, okay, the rise of populist party, nationalist populist party and anti-migrant political parties in particular is unfortunately not limited to Italy or France or Germany. Yeah. If you look at Sweden and Denmark in recent years, the rise of extreme right-wing party has been pretty spectacular, and to the point where some like the Social Democratic Party in Denmark today has started to implement anti-refugee policy, like deciding that application for refugee status will be filled in Africa rather than in Denmark, that are far beyond what any extreme right-wing party will
Sure.
officially ask for, in terms of completely forgetting about international law and convention with what refugee status is all about. So I'm asking the question, I guess, is what do you think is missing in the Nordic recipe, from your analysis, in order to prevent that kind of evolution from happening, or is there anything we can do? Because in your description, it looked as if, okay, you had the sort of good countries, the bad countries, but in practice, when we look at this kind of evolution, it doesn't seem like as if Nordic countries are insulated from that.
So that's a fantastic question, and I'm so glad you asked that, because that's probably one of the most important questions that can be asked about this kind of argument, and it's something that we deal with extensively in the book. So maybe something that I want to clarify right from the get-go is, sorry?
For our friends online, can you please just repeat the question? So that
I'm sorry. Yes, certainly. So
summary.
yeah, just for a short summary, Thomas is pointing out that much in the literature about populism has been made about its association with the rise of immigration, with the 2015 European migrant crisis, and he's noted the way in which, in the Scandinavian countries, that there has been a degree of populism that has taken place that has been quite notable compared to historical precedents. You can think of examples like the Sweden Democrats, which, to your credit, Thomas, you say that they have pushed the mainstream into a position which is more decidedly anti-immigrant and anti-refugee in ways that might violate international law. Even. So there are a few points to make about addressing that. One is that I want to clarify right from the get-go that the way we're conceptualizing this, we're not imagining that there are just binary good and bad countries. We're imagining this as populism being a continuum where it's not either like Brexit and Alexander or Canada. You can be somewhere in between, and there are a variety of ways to cut it. That being said, what we're arguing specifically about economic fairness and social mobility is that they sort of provide like a firewall against populism. And it's not bulletproof, but we're arguing that it prevents the worst excesses of a liberal populism, coming to totally dominate and sweep the country's politics in a way that you might have seen through things like Brexit, the hold of populist politics in places like Italy and France, parts of Eastern Europe. And the further thing I'd add is that, with the incidents of the 2015 European migrant crisis in the Scandinavian countries, there certainly was a response. It certainly was the case that, for example, the Sweden Democrats got up to around 20% of the vote share. But that being said, it didn't spill over into the sort of runaway effects like was seen in other countries. And for example, in the 2019 European Parliament elections, the vote shares for populists in Scandinavian countries were below the European Union average. So I don't see the Nordic countries as decisive cases of populism run amok. I see it as more of there was a huge explosion of immigration, which caused a very real reckoning in society that led to populist forces gaining more traction for sure. That's absolutely true, but not to such an extent that it became a runaway phenomenon. It didn't connect like it did in other places where you could tie the perception of immigration to economic unfairness within that country. Like there was this great quote from The Economist in 2019, for example, where they were interviewing populist voters for Alternative für Deutschland in Eastern Europe. And they noted that generally the voters they were interviewing disliked being labeled as racist, and that they were really more concerned about being left behind by the state when they felt that funds were being diverted to newcomers. So that's sort of the way that we're arguing there. I'll just sort of sweep. Yeah, go ahead.
I have a question with respect to how you, for example, differentiate yourself from the egalitarianism as an end in itself argument. Yeah. Because to an extent, I view one of the main justifications that for such an argument is that it's difficult to insulate it from social mobility, for example. And one question that I have is that, for example, if you introduce a notion of political power, for example, and especially if you do a dynamic analysis, what if, for example, like if we accept that the US was at some point the land of opportunity where there was social mobility, but to the extent that there is no protection of equality as an end in itself, then gradually, even if the inequalities that result are fair, if we can say something like that, and there's an aggregation of political power that can rig the system for the ones that have won, be it fair, be it not, then isn't there, I think that's a major justification of egalitarianism as an end in itself.
Again, that's a really super question, and I'm so glad you asked that. And again, it's something that we do address in the book. The way that we're viewing it is that, you are absolutely right that even if unfair outcomes are achieved in a fair way, if they're very high, and there's just scads of research to support this, just pick up why nations fail. That if society, economic outcomes in society are far too unequal, then that in of itself represents a de facto imbalance of political power and then can be wielded to shape the system in unfair ways. Now, the argument we're making is that we're specifically concerned with the contemporary wave of developed world populism. And we're arguing that the extent to which this phenomenon has taken place of economic elites sort of rigging the political system, in most cases is still fairly limited compared to a lot of historical examples. Yeah, I mean, you might think of countries under the influence of colonialism, or a lot of developing countries today where the Gini coefficients are just through the roof. And we're contending that that certainly is something that you need to be aware of. But once you sort of tackle the degree of economic inequality in society to a reasonable limit where it can't be easily abused in that way, then you need to look at other inputs that support social mobility other than just reducing the abuse of power by elites. And B, you also need to look very carefully at the extent to which you have rules that protect the functioning of the political system against the influence of elites. I mean, like, for example, there's this great statistic looking at the share of billionaires' wealth in a country as a share of GDP. And for example, in Sweden, notoriously, it's actually quite a bit higher than in the US. And yet in the US, you have this whole political lobbying industry that's tied up with the economic interests, arguably, of elites. And you might argue that in that case, it's perhaps less due to the sheer economic imbalance in society and more arguably due to the rules and regulations that are set in place that constrain the way in which that can happen. So sort of a long-winded way to say that you're absolutely right, that is a key constraint. We're just saying that if you're looking at high-income countries today where populism is happening, it's important to look beyond that. Yes?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Eric. Fascinating discussion. My question is, so if I understand the key message of the book is that to reclaim populism, we should focus perhaps less on inequality per se and more on fairness,
Yes.
i.e. Social mobility.
For example, yes.
For example, so if we look back at 40 years of political proposals and political cycles, isn't this kind of shift in the message, in the political message? So moving away from focusing on what you call progressive redistribution towards, let's look at social mobility, let's look at equality of opportunities. Isn't this what happened actually in the 1990s in Europe, in the US, for instance? When I think, of Tony Blair in the UK, or
Okay, I see
Bill
where you're
Clinton
going.
in the US, or Schröder in Germany.
Sure.
And in these countries, isn't it these parties actually that thereafter led to the rise of populist movements?
So, okay, that's a really fantastic point. Again, it's one that we address in the book, and it's something where we want to make a really clear message, like, don't confuse us with the sort of new labor thing of the 1990s, because that's not what we're arguing. Well, we are arguing that movements like New Labor, in a way, I can see what you're saying, that they sort of were like, okay, let's take the rough edges off capitalism and sort of make it smoother and maybe focus a little more on equality of opportunity. But I don't think it was fully thought through in the exact way we're proposing. And I don't think it was necessarily executed along those lines. Like, for example, looking at Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, their emphasis on boosting social mobility was education, education, education. And what we're arguing is that you got to look way beyond education. That is important, but there are all these other inputs to social mobility. And what's more, it's also really important not to conflate the inputs to social mobility, like I said, with sort of laissez-faire neoliberalism, which at least my view is that those sort of 1990 movements were to an extent caught up in that. Yes.
Good evening. My question is focused on democratic alignment and a unilateral mindset.
Uh-huh.
So particularly the European Union, that's a strong multilateral framework for development settings.
Uh-huh.
Now, for inequality, social mobility for populations, but also for state power inside alignments. And of course, when you have redistribution and investments through a central framework, how much of the scope when your lab is looking at this, to consider the specific data trace frameworks, for example, the European Parliamentary Research Service to a lesser extent, but also like the NETS evaluation services, because has not been developed or well funded for the past 20 years, 18 years, and has not really developed with changing the economic or socio-political economic ecosystems through European development.
Okay, so let me maybe ask, can you try to rephrase that question, and then I'll repeat it in a way that's maybe a little more concrete for maybe some of the non-technical members of the digital audience. Like, are you talking about?
I'm talking about assessing the importance of data evaluation systems from
Of data
a multilateral
evaluation
framework.
Sure.
Despite the fact having national members, of course, with their own resources, but a multilateral framework assessing democratic alignments through these multilateral institutions, and thus through securing less avenues of populism to take over.
Oh, okay, so again, just to clarify, you're inquiring as to the importance of sort of data collection and assessment at, say, the NUTS 2 level in the European Union by various supranational bodies.
Particularly through multilateral frameworks,
Right.
but in evaluating their role in reclaiming populism.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I'm going to be honest. It's something that I don't think we've touched on it in the book. What I can say off the top of my head is that I probably need to sit down and think about it a little more. I think that there could be important ways in which you could use that kind of further, more detailed data collection to get a better angle on some of the things that are maybe driving economic unfairness and low social mobility in these countries. You could think about, are there supranational mechanisms to coordinate, funds or assess where they are most sorely needed in order to increase economic opportunity and equal opportunity. But like I said, it's something that perhaps is a bit more of a specialist angle on supranational frameworks in the European Union. We're sort of more concentrated on, I guess, almost national level, a national or subnational way of thinking about, well, what's driving populism in these locales, and can you come up with ways to get an angle on what could hold back equal opportunity to a degree, abstracting a little bit from the solutions that you could use to apply to that. Does that help?
Very, thank you.
Okay. You've had your hand up for a while, haven't you? Yeah.
Thank you. That's fairness. So my question is, so there are some candidates that are proposing an agenda based on economic fairness and redistribution, but are not gaining enough votes to win an election. For instance, Bernie Sanders in the US, or in France, we have Jean-Luc Mélenchon. So my question is, if they're proposing that what the people want, why are they not gaining momentum and able to win the election?
Yeah, okay, fantastic point. And that's actually especially an important question to ask to sort of clarify the thesis of our book. And it's that we don't see aggressive redistribution and equalization of outcomes as compatible with economic fairness and social mobility. That's the reason why Jeremy Corbyn imploded, and Bernie Sanders hasn't had much success across the pond either. You can see here, I said that this cannot be confused with conflicting ideological goals like aggressive redistribution. I mean, if you're going down to these populist voters, like for example, there's this great study by the late Alberto Alsina where they did a study looking at voters' preferences for redistribution across different places in the developed world. And they found that right-wing voters with low confidence in government do not see redistribution as a good way to enact greater social mobility in society. And whatever maybe if you have a different view from mine, you might think that redistribution is important. I don't think you're going to sell it to those voters. I think that they're really focused on equal opportunity and reward according to contribution, which, if you have reward strongly according to contribution, is not really compatible with like a Corbynist type agenda. Were you, I don't know who's
Mine is
first.
related. but-
So, okay.
Right, it's just the other side of the same question. because
Uh-huh.
How come then all these populist leaders are probably the most unfairly successful person ever and still they're elected? I mean, Berlusconi, Salvini,
That's-
Italy and Trump,
Yeah.
and whatever, Boris Johnson.
Yeah, no, I mean, Donald Trump, like, come on. Yeah, no, I mean, that's a really great point. And it's something that we address in chapter 1 of the book. And the point there is that, voters, again, perceive unfairness not necessarily all the time in terms of just whether outcomes are unequal, but whether outcomes are fair or unfair. And, I think you might be right that a lot of these candidates have in practice made their wealth in unfair ways, but it sort of depends on the extent to which they can convince the electorate. So, I mean, like, look at like Trump in the US. I mean, the guy obviously like inherited pretty much all of his fortune and everything like that, and yet he's managed to convince people that I'm on your side. I'm not going to practice this condescension of the culture wars against you. I'm going to fight for you, and I understand you, and blah blah blah. So even though you might be right in practice, it depends how the political candidate, I think, can spin it to a large extent.
He was attacked for that, to be there unfair.
Oh.
The other side.
Like from the political, like from the Democrats. I mean, yeah, no, absolutely. It's just that they couldn't land it. Like I think this might be an area where as we sort of touch on in the book, we think the main thrust of populism is economic unfairness, but we think cultural factors can accelerate it. And this is an instance where it might be that if a candidate has achieved their wealth in an unfair way, but angles the framing of the culture wars so that they'll align themselves with a certain side, they might still be able to convince voters that oh yeah, my rise was completely fair, and that the Democrats or whoever you're talking about are just spewing nonsense. So it depends. Yeah. I'll just go left to right. Yeah.
So thank you for your presentation, first of all. You talked about, so you said that we're targeting a fairer economy. And what I missed in your presentation was a concrete example of policy. So how do you want to basically, so if you want to give me an example of a policy that you are making to basically make an economy fair. Of course, we have now institution for taxation, we have institution for justice. They are all responsible for some of those rectangles in this flowchart. But what is that you're bringing new as a proposal?
Yeah.
And I would appreciate it if you could, for example, go through a concrete example. As for example, if I want to give you an example, so if somebody talks about, I don't know. If somebody talks about co-management system and says that, okay, co-management system is my proposal for France to make everything more fair, then he can point out to the Nordic countries and Germany and say, we have co-management there, it's working, that's the result, blah, blah, blah. So do you have a proposal and an example of that proposal being implemented somewhere and being reliable?
Fantastic. So that's a really great question. And this is, again, something where I want to emphasize that a way that the book is unique is that we do have a really concrete vision for policy prescriptions. And I apologize if I didn't sufficiently explain it, but please let me try again. And it's that we're viewing this tree of inputs as a wide variety of policy inputs that support social mobility, and they could be anything from anti-discrimination laws to a tolerant culture to sufficient access to vocational and high and university education at an affordable rate. Transport infrastructure. It goes on and on. Unemployment insurance, healthcare. But the critical thing is that you start with this net of what are all the possible things that are needed to support social mobility together, and then you apply the diagnostic method to zoom in on a particular country. And then again, due to sort of the brevity of time, I perhaps wasn't able to present this in full detail. It is in the book, but you apply this diagnostic procedure that we use at the Harvard Growth Lab to identify like what are the specific constraints in a particular country that most hold back social mobility, what's the political economy syndrome that underpins those constraints, and what could you do as a therapeutic in order to resolve it. And we have sort of miniature case studies and analyses for the US, the UK, Italy, and France. And I hope that'll sort of whet your appetite for looking into that more. As if I can give sort of like a concrete and perhaps an almost over obvious example, you could think of healthcare in the U.S., where the just the share of GDP and the amount of spending that goes into healthcare in the U.S. is just like way above and beyond what's in any other developed country. You have medical bankruptcy as the leading cause of personal bankruptcy in the US in a way that obviously holds back economic opportunity. And you have life expectancy on par with Eastern Europe, as opposed to where you might think it ought to be for other Western countries. So that implementing some sort of a universal healthcare system would be an example in the US. That being said, I think you asked, have we actually worked to implement any of these proposals so far? The answer is not yet, but I am next week, presenting at the UK in a few places, such as, the think tank Onward, which is tightly tied into the leveling up debate in the United Kingdom. And I can just say, I hope that I can get something for you. Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm not sure who it is. Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. As far as I understood, you talked about like the national level as an aggregate, and I was wondering if like your relation between populism and social mobility still holds true if you like at subgroups.
Yes.
For example, looking at gender or race, and looking into that, whether like people who have less social mobility actually like are more populist. If you look at subgroups.
Yeah, so that's a great point. The one thing I'd say is that I wish I had individual level data tracking like what happened to people intergenerationally over time. In practice, that data is kind of hard to get at. So what we do is we look at different geographies and we look at different geographical levels. We do some country by country comparisons. We also do subnational comparisons, looking at like different counties in the US and different départements in France.
But not gender or race.
Well, you can enter controls for that, and we do that sort of thing. But it's sort of difficult because of the data restrictions to get like what is the social mobility that has transpired for this particular gender or this particular race, unfortunately.
But couldn't you say that in general, like that black folks are hindered more from social mobility than white ones, and then you can compare like the level of populist voting among black people and white people? Wouldn't that be possible?
In principle, it could be. I mean, there is a really nice paper. I'm forgetting the authors at the moment, but what they do is sort of an interesting thing along those lines that maybe could be extended into this. Maybe this is a line for future research, where they decompose the evolution of inequality in the US over time in a really interesting way, where they say to what extent is it explainable by unfair factors like sort of uncontrollable demographic things like race, like gender, like your family wealth. What they do is they find that the influence of family wealth in the US on individual economic success has skyrocketed over the past couple of decades, which is perhaps not surprising. But maybe there could be an extension for research along those lines in particular. I think, yeah, sorry, let's go there and then there, yeah.
I don't know that we buy or understand the argument that populist voters vote because they don't like unfair economy or they want more social mobility. Like in the quote you did by Roderick, I think he talks about perceived unfairness. I think in the quote by the swing voter, he's saying he worked harder than the rest.
Yeah.
And he should get like a bigger outcome. But I feel like maybe I'm wrong, but don't they vote to right choices, populist right choices, because they see social mobility happening like below them? And how do I know that they are not actually in the second chart where it's like fair inequality, and they are not the blue guy that didn't like have the opportunity, didn't have effort, and the other ones are like the migrants that come, they actually put a lot of effort there. So they start thinking, okay, actually, my perception is like I work harder than him, but he's getting more. I don't know how to differentiate.
Yeah, no. It's an interesting question, and I'm glad you asked it. I mean, sorry, I've been forgetting to repeat these questions for the online audience. I just realized I'll repeat it sort of succinctly now. You're sort of asking, like, could it not be the case that, say, these like right-wing populist voters, I mean, it could be left-wing populist voters too. That happens in some countries as well. Perhaps they're really motivated by, the argument I'm sort of thinking of is almost like Francis Fukuyama's identity, where he's talking about it's like a loss of status. It's like maybe there are these new groups coming in that are threatening my status and my identity. And therefore, I'm going to go to this sort of nativist place where we're just going to exclude outsiders. I mean, I think it would be interesting to study that, but my perception at least would be that I'm not totally sure that would necessarily be the case. I would be puzzled, like how would you compare that to this pattern of like low social mobility specifically and robustly matching up with the geography of populism. Like it would be sort of strange in a place with more unequal more unequal opportunity and limited economic opportunity generally, that you would then have this like additional hypothesis that actually there are some groups that maybe they're in that place, maybe they're in other places that are doing better. I'm not sure how you would dice that, but I think I would find it generally sort of hard to reconcile with that pattern. Yeah, I hope that answers it to an extent. It's an interesting question though. One to think about. Sorry, we had a hand here. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm just trying to see to what extent I think I didn't understand part of the general framework. So you have, if I had to summarize, one of the big motto of this was to say, from a policy perspective, you want equality of opportunity and a fair unequal outcome, right?
Yeah.
So the way I understand this is like you're not focused on, you're kind of focused on correcting the inequality in the process, but not so much in the outcome. So you would not bother so much as long as the outcome is an outcome of a fair process of opportunities, even if that leads to inequality. So the question that comes to mind is then how do you measure, like how would you define who is to decide what's fair inequality? How do you even separate these two processes? So in theory, you can think about it in a, like with logical thoughts about these two being separated and want to focus on one and not the other. But in practice, I think it joins some of the questions that was asked. These are very much intricate processes linked to each other, right? So you cannot really separate that this is from the process and this is the inequality in the outcome that I'm saying.
Okay, so that's a really fantastic question. I'll repeat it for the audience that's online. It was asking, how can you possibly separate sort of, unfairness in the process from simple inequalities of outcome, if I'm understanding you correctly? It's like, how can you look at a situation and know that some sort of inequality of outcome happened for fair or unfair reasons, and who is to judge whether something is a fair or unfair reason for an inequality? That's a fantastic question. So a couple of things that I would say about that. First of all, it depends a lot. If you're interested in this in a policymaker, it sort of depends a lot about what the debate and the consensus in society is as to what constitutes a fair or unfair reason for inequalities, occurring. So, for example, we're looking at low social mobility, and we're portraying that as a very, unfair process. If you come from, say a working class family, and it's very difficult to make your way into the middle or the upper class, and meanwhile you have this like self-perpetuating upper class, we see that as very unfair because there's inequality of opportunity. Now, I mean, whether the electorate actually agrees with that sort of thing, or whether it agrees with things like, you can think of race or gender or things like that being potentially things that today are considered unfair determinants of success, but maybe historically they weren't. So it's I would say in practice, it's tough, and it's sort of a process that if you're a democratic policymaker, to an extent, you have to put the society in. You have to say, if you are concerned with the problem of populism specifically, you maybe want to ask, well, like, what are the things that in practice actually do tend to, make people upset and feel that it's an unfair system. With regard to the measurement of that sort of thing, I will say that is a very complicated process to do. What we're using here, for example, is like I said, low social mobility, because that's sort of like a metric where there is decent data availability, and it seems to be like a reasonably clear violation of economic fairness in the way that I stated out in all those behavioral science papers and what have you. Of course, if you're really serious about this, you probably want to go into as much detail and more detail than just intergenerational income elasticity. You want to ask, how do factors like race or gender or what have you constrain these sorts of things? And for that, sadly, the data that is available is often not very good. I mentioned this one paper about decomposing the evolution of inequality in the US over time. That's like an effort in that direction. But I certainly would be enthused to see a lot more careful attention collecting data. Maybe that goes to your point a little bit about more data collection on fronts like those. I hope that helps to answer that. Yeah.
So I understand your point that it's not inequality per se; it's the perceived unfairness. But I know, Musk and Bezos and whatever, they weigh very heavily on our perception.
Yeah.
And if I clean toilets for 40 hours a week and they make 5,000 times what I make in a year, don't you think that should be a top priority in addressing populism? Because of the perception, the way they weigh in our perception. So, because it's inherently unfair, at least in my opinion. Okay,
so that's a really good question. To repeat it for you guys online, the question was about if you have people like Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos or what have you, who are just making like egregious amounts of money, and you might argue sometimes in unfair ways, like through very monopolistic behavior, if you're thinking of like Jeff Bezos, for example, then how can you possibly not see that as a priority to tackle? To respond to you, I would say that that should be tackled, but because of the way those American billionaires often tend to accrue their wealth in a way that is very unfair, that depends a lot on rent seeking. There was this great article in The Economist a couple of years ago where they were comparing billionaires in Sweden, again, to billionaires in the US. And there's this really puzzling phenomenon that that the wealth held by billionaires in Sweden, like I said, is a higher share of GDP than in the US. And yet attitudes towards billionaires in Sweden are way more positive, like people love them. And so the explanation there that The Economist offers, and certainly I would buy into, is that there's a difference in the rent seeking that occurs and the degree of fairness which occurred for those billionaires in question to accrue their wealth. And they do provide statistics for this and show that, in the case of think of somebody who founded like H&M or something like that, or Spotify. If you're going and you're founding like an internationally competitive company and you're not monopolizing and you're not sort of screwing people over, then you might argue, as the Swedes probably would on the whole, that that's a fair way to get your wealth, and that you're not weighing down on society in a weird way. And the contrast in the US. You might argue that is a problem. And certainly I could, in some cases, see an argument for that these billionaires have accrued their wealth in a really unfair way, but not only that, because of the way they're monopolizing the system and engaging in all this rent seeking, that they are actually holding people back. And that's a serious problem.
Sure, I understand your point, but I would say it's, at least for me, a bit orthogonal that, okay, some of them maybe are rent seekers, but even if it was Spotify was a perfect idea, just the fact that you're able to make 5,000 times what the other makes, and the other guy's cleaning toilets all day, it's inherently unfair, at least for me. Even in Sweden, even whatever it is.
Right. So
I would put the ceiling of a sort or a super progressive tax, but I don't know. That's just my view.
Right. So I mean, okay. Let me answer that by. Sorry, I should repeat that first for the people online. There's the point that, even if these people are accruing their wealth in a way that is completely fair, shouldn't we be worried about that because of the sheer inequalities that exist? The first thing that I would say is that I don't think people are, necessarily completely intolerant of unequal outcomes in all their forms. And I don't think that most people, and especially the populist electorate, which, if you're stereotyping a little bit, it tends to be sort of, rural conservative voters with low trust in government. I don't think they necessarily innately detest the sheer existence of billionaires per se. So, if your goal is reclaiming populism, I would argue that that's not the angle you want to take. The other thing that I would say, though, is that there's a really key debate that has to occur around what kind of outcomes are fair in society and are commensurate to contribution. And I mean, you might make the arguments, and again, it depends on what the electorate is and who you're selling this to, but you might make the argument, depending on where you are, that some people are compensated way above and beyond what they deserve. There's the famous statistic, for instance, of like the ratio of CEO pay to the pay of an average worker in the US. It used to be something like 20 times more. Now it's like 300 times more. And you might make an argument, and it could be convincing that it's just not fair. It's above and beyond what they should be compensated. So I hate to give the classic economist answer, but again, it sort of depends. It really does depend on how fair those processes were and whether people actually are being rewarded according to their contribution. Yeah.
Again, my question is related to my previous, the policy and the question of the gentleman. Are your policy basically taking into account the fact that the inequality resulting from the fair economy will not jeopardize the fairness itself?
Yeah, sure.
So to give you a concrete example, how would your policy guarantee that X, Y, Z billionaire would not rig an election and through that would not change the economic policy? Are you considering that in your policy making or proposals basically? Or if yes, again, sorry that I'm looking for concrete examples. Where would be that in that flowchart?
Yeah. Okay. So I'll just repeat that for the audience online. So that was I think we had a similar question before, but I'll reiterate it anyway. It's that how can you be sure that if you have a situation where unequal outcomes are achieved in a fair way, how can you be sure that that won't lead to abuse of power and then create an unfair system? So I think I sort of touched on this earlier, but maybe I'll elaborate on it a little bit. Part of it is, I'll bring up that chart for you. Hello. Sorry, it's going a little haywire here. There we go. So you're right that isn't necessarily in this chart here, but it's mentioned in other ways in the book. And the caveat that you do have to protect against that is just something that we argue is not necessarily a huge contributor to the the varying way in which social mobility has unfolded in different countries across the developed world today. So, if you're thinking of, like I mentioned earlier, there are many developing countries where you absolutely critically have to be aware of that mechanism. You might think of it in historical context, and you might think of it looking into the future, where you could worry that even if there are fair, unequal outcomes today, that they could evolve into something that is deeply unfair, and that certainly is something to guard against. But the emphasis in this book is really, again, that we're concretely looking at the developed countries today that are dealing with populism. And our argument is that the lack of social mobility that occurs in these countries is to a very large extent the result of policy failures and not necessarily just sheerly the abuse of elites. Does that help? Yeah. Yeah.
I have 2 more questions for you.
Sure.
Going off of what he said, looking at lobbying systems in developed countries, especially in the United States and the European Union, how and enacting the model that you've been doing, not the model, but the policy position of your book, how have you considered the complications and the balance of necessary communication of lobbyists and the obvious corruption that is inherent with most Western lobbying systems and actually implementing these for integral work. Question one.
Okay, let's deal with that first, and then let's go to the second question. So the question there, which was a really spectacular one, and it actually, I'll point it out in a minute here, was how can you be sure that lobbyists are not going to completely derail this entire process? If you're like a policymaker and you're trying to pass through reforms that are going to say reduce the amount of cheating in society by monopolists or rent seekers or what have you, how can you be sure that lobby makers aren't going to derail that? Where does that fit in this framework? And the argument that I would put to you, or at least mention, is that we do deal with it in sort of this section here, where you're dealing with punishing cheaters through the justice system and through taxation and regulation in order to ensure that lobbying, insofar as it does occur, ought not to be so egregious that it just derails the democratic process. And I think that certainly in some countries today, the United States, for example, I think you could make a strong case for increased protections against lobbying to reduce that process. Is that okay? Should we move to the second one?
To touch upon that, for example, the United States, it's more, at least from my experience, it's more difficult to pass laws related to lobbying because in order to do so, you have to be a lobbyist and talk to people who get funded by lobbyists.
Yeah.
So it's more cyclical, and it's notoriously difficult to break from just an exterior standpoint and a US standpoint, for example. So if you go ahead for particularly the United States, France, United Kingdom, any of the very, very westernized nations, have you considered possible avenues for political strategy in order to do so, in order to break into and get a foothold in those? That's
okay.
the end of my question.
Okay, sure. So the question there for those online was, does the book consider any particular political strategies in order to implement lobbying protections, given that there is sort of a vicious cycle that if you have weak lobbying protections and you're trying to increase lobbying protections, well, the lobbyists aren't going to be very happy about that, and they're going to come in and lobby against the anti-lobbying rules, which is a great question. I will say it's not something that we deal with extensively in the book. I can say that practically, I think that one of the only ways that you would be able to tackle it is you'd have to have like a really strong democratic mandate in order to do so. And it might be that if you're in a country where you think that lobbying is like a really serious problem, you probably are going to have to, go through the polls to that and build a campaign with that as some sort of a prominent feature. And in that way, hopefully win enough electoral support to get it through. I mean, that's the only practical route, right? It's a really tough problem, sort of as you point out, because there is this sort of vicious reinforcing cycle.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And my second question, thank you for your time, is once again focused on European Union, most in France.
Mm-hmm.
So of course, with Emmanuel Macron's economic policy, it focuses a lot on one part. And if you look at his 2016 program, and also read his book, which was a little bit before, and then I'll keep a track of him and Bruno's collaborations and outside Parliament for the past 4 years. It still focuses very strongly on SME development and independent empowerment of outside of the geographic centralization of Paris, Marseille, etc. And it focuses on generation of social, political, and fiscal capital from working in middle classes from decentralization. So my question is, how effective do you think, just from the perspective of within your framework, how then this would be effective in combating French populism, especially since it does have a large geographic movement, and also if you believe that this would be something that would be sustainable within the developmental economic system.
Right, fantastic. Sorry, you have a point?
Yeah, the point is, unfortunately, it's already 7:30, so we have 1 minute to answer this question.
Okay, we have 1 minute. I'm going to blaze through it. The question was basically like, have Emmanuel Macron's policies been effective in combating populism in France? I would say Macron is a complicated and very interesting figure. We actually have a special section in the book that sort of discusses him at length that I would encourage you to read. But the short answer is that I think he's done a lot of things right, but he's also made a few slip-ups in kind of egregious ways, in ways that especially pertain to his political positioning and messaging. That being said, I think a lot of his economic policy has been squarely targeted at greater support for fair and equal outcomes, and I think that's why he has, to an extent, had some electoral success to date.
Thank you so
Okay.
much for sticking to the time, and as we understand, many other answers are in the book. So thanks for that.
Yeah, thank you all so much. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so I think, coming back to Lucas' question, I think if you want to distance yourself from realism, you have to be, I don't know, I think you should be a bit more careful, the way you're talking aggressive, aggressive extremism, it seems very aggressive for many people, so you have to be careful about that, because at the end of the day, nobody implementing aggressive restriction has been in power in any country for I don't know, so at the end, it's very, it's very aggressive, because you're not referring to any fact-based evaluation of, country, if Sanders and Warren have been in power.
I started when
It's not in power. Yeah.
No.
So that's the problem, is that you are criticizing things which have not been implemented. Whereas Populism and Untitled have been implemented. And so, as the way you frame your political message to me looks very much like back to the 90s.
Okay, well,
so
appreciate that.
So I think many people will feel this way. I mean, so people who feel that Blair was the future of the world will be very happy, but for people who feel that this has already been tried,
Sure.
so I think you have to be very careful about that. And the electorate the electoral is much younger than the primaries, and the electorate voting for Biden, so I don't want to insult the future too much.
No, okay, fair enough. I appreciate that.
You cannot be elected only forever, so but anyway. No, the discussion was very interesting. People had lots of questions.
I'm glad.
This will continue forever.
Yeah.
So online, I mean, some were kind of
Right.
So there was a bit.
Hey, we'll send you a copy of the book. Okay. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Eric. I also need to go up. So I don't know. Offer kind of a welcome package to tour across Paris tonight. I don't know what you're doing. Hotel is around.
Yeah, it's quite close by. Yeah.
Okay. And you're leaving tomorrow to the UK.
Well, actually, I'm going to visit some friends in actually tomorrow, but
All right. And so
Oh, yeah, that's fantastic. Let's drop me a line.
So we have more time to discuss, to continue discussion. I fully read the book by then.
Oh, thank you.
And, yeah,
Yeah, thanks.
so hopefully see you in
Yeah. Drop me a line. Stuff like that.
And so the roadmap is kept by then
he sort of helps out on projects. He's got sort of some stuff going on.
Great. Be there for some time.
I've been here for about 2 years.
Great. Cool.
Yeah, take care. Thanks so much. Thanks for
I really enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you.
More on your affiliations, I think I didn't read very much into your but your affiliations with the World Inequality Lab versus Harvard.
Oh, I'm not affiliated with the World Inequality. No, I'm with the Harvard Growth Lab, and I met up with Henry Deffen I don't know if you know him, he's one
I do
of,
not.
he's one of Thomas's PhD students. And so he actually just did a presentation.
I'm not from.
Oh,
I'm
okay,
not
don't worry about it. Yeah.
economics, I'm from Sorbonne.
Oh, okay. Well, anyway, he basically was sort of quid pro quo. He did a presentation at, Brookline at Harvard, so I came over here to join here.
Oh, you mean Thomas
yeah.
Dickens, he's
Yeah.
Oh, no, never mind, I know what you're talking about.
Oh, yeah.
We met.
Oh, there you go. Yeah.
Okay, well, John, thank you very much for presenting this.
Yeah, cool. Well, thank you so much for coming for the, insightful, detailed questions.
Of course, it's, my questions were pointed because I'm not sure, so I'm a researcher in democratic alignment in French France. And a lot of it is, you were right, by the way, I completed a study last year about alignment database covering anything that your broker studied in 20 years.
Wow.
And it was all down to unemployment, and economics, but which might have been predicted, but it wasn't. It ended up covering every issue, but it wasn't just economics. There was a brand of progressive economics that even attracted right-wing populists. So
Interesting.
something interesting for friends.
Yeah, definitely.
Maybe.
Cool.
But have a wonderful evening and welcome to us.
Yeah, thank you. Nice meeting you.
Hey.
Hey.
So glad you did go. I'm just checking.
Good, yeah.
I think we're still live on YouTube.
I think so. I think it went really well. The audience was like really engaged, had questions going overtime and everything like that.
That's great.
Yeah.